I'm Indy. Welcome to another episode of Out of the Ether, where I read the best, most interesting, and most controversial comments that you guys have written to us about the Great War. All right, this is from one of our longtime Russian fans. Before the Great War, use of Chinese labor in Russia was prohibited due to fear of the yellow danger. However, the ban was lifted by the end of 1914 as the demand for labor force increased a big deal. The hiring of workers was done not by government agencies, but commercial companies and recruiting agents. Chinese authorities demanded that hiring be done under proper and thorough contracts, detailing many aspects of working, transportation, and housing conditions and protection of the Chinese workers. It also demanded that Chinese labor cannot be involved in war activities, including digging of trenches, etc., as the Chinese government was pressed by the Germans, accusing China in breaching their neutrality. The Russian government gave its assurances, but this was not fulfilled in practice by contractors of the Ministry of Defense. German agents in China organized propaganda in the press, trying to dissuade the Chinese from looking for employment in Russia by spreading false rumors of using the Chinese for digging trenches and even fighting at the front. I had no idea about this. This is great. Chinese officials were slow in issuing passports to Chinese workers. So in 1916, Russia allowed Chinese to cross the border without passports. According to Russian data, from January 1915 to April 1917, the number of Chinese that arrived in Russia by railroad was 159,972 men. Most of them were deployed throughout the European part of Russia. They worked at railroad construction, in mines, timber cutting, and so forth. Working conditions were harsh sometimes, so there were cases of strikes and even uprisings of Chinese workers. Usually, the Russian government was dissolving conflict issues in favor of the Chinese. So it was employers, contractors, or Chinese team leaders who abused the Chinese, not the Tsarist administration. The Chinese got in big trouble after February and especially October revolutions. They lost their work and they lost their links with the motherland. Both the interim and Soviet governments acknowledged the problem with Chinese immigrants and tried to solve it. Things were getting better after China recognized the interim government in July 1917, but turned worse as China refused to recognize Bolsheviks being pressed by Western countries. Soviets, however, tried to take care of Chinese workers as Soviets declared working classes their top priority. By spring 1919, around 40,000 Chinese were returned by railroad to China, but later the uprising of the Czechoslovakian Corps in May 1919 cut off Siberia from the Bolsheviks. Around 10,000 Chinese returned home through Batumi and Turkey. Around 1,000 were evacuated from Murmansk by the English Expeditionary Force. After Brest Peace Treaty, the Germans and Austrians sent all Chinese in captivity there to Russia. Being a Chinese prisoner in Germany was a terrible thing. They were forced to work heavily, but were fed very poorly, so the death toll among the Chinese were very high. During the Civil War, conditions for many Chinese who happened to be in places of conflicts were rather dire. Some of the Chinese made gangs and looting and even terrorizing local populations. Some gangs were even hired by the Bolsheviks. Iona Yakir is said to be the first who organized a Chinese regiment in the Red Army. Figures of Chinese fighting in the Red Army differ from 30 to 40,000 by historians up to 60 to 70,000 by Chinese diplomats. Some of them joined the army for ideological issues, but for most, it was a bare necessity to get food and a chance to return home. Chinese proved to be good and stout soldiers. Some of them were even bodyguards for Bolsheviks and the Kremlin. Bolshevik propaganda had great success, so most of the Chinese fought for the Reds, not for the Whites. By mid-1921, they left around 120,000 Chinese in Russia, 90,000 in Europe, 30,000 in Siberia. During the havoc of the Revolution and Civil War, some of the Chinese in Russia organized the Union of Chinese Citizens and later the Union of Chinese Workers, aiming to organize help and assistance to the Chinese in Russia. These organizations got support from the Bolsheviks. After the Chinese embassy left Russia in 1918, the Union of Chinese Workers was left as the only organization to provide communications between Russian and Chinese governments. That was great. That was very, very interesting. I'll tell you what, we did an entire special about China just before and during World War I. You can click right here to see that. Don't forget to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and subscribe. See you next time.